Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Michael Spitzer, who is a professor of music at the University of Liverpool, and also the author of this book called The Musical Human, A History of Life on Earth. Welcome, Michael.
Nice to meet you.
Well, look, I really enjoyed this book. I've had a lot of podcasts where we have tried to figure out what makes humans unique, right? So there have been a lot of different answers to this question. And I think you alluded to probably the most common answer, which is that humans are the symbolic species, right? The species with language and the capacity for reason and abstract thinking. But you're tossing out maybe a different definition, right? In addition to that, of course, you've got this idea of homo musicus, right? Something about humans that makes them uniquely musical. And a big part of the book is about trying to figure out exactly when and how that break took place. Because I think a lot of us want to believe that music, because it's so universal, it must be, rooted in nature. And you talk a lot about how oftentimes our music will allude to nature in sort of a onomatopoeia way, right? Where we imitate the sounds of animals and maybe even the sounds of, rivers and wind and so forth. And so, I mean, I guess we can't tell when music began, but we do have some clues. We're limited by the archaeological record because, songs don't survive, but, bone flutes do, and maybe some kind of resonant percussion instruments might. But, do we have any sense about when and where we became this musical creature?
Sure we do. Birds have music. Humpback whales have music to some extent. Cicadas and katydids stridulate in rhythm. That's music. And they're all around us. And so we can look to the trees or the seas dive into the deepest time possible and extrapolate backwards. So I say in my book that we are also the great synthesizers. We take what insects can do, which is rhythm. Birds have this gift called vocal learning, which means that they can creatively learn new songs. They don't just inherit calls. And bird songs are hierarchically structured like language. They have layers. So they repeat patterns at rising layers of complexity, as do humpback whales. But whales have something that birds don't have. They have culture. So in any hemisphere, there's a population of whales which essentially sing the same song. And these songs slowly evolve over a 5-year period, at which point the entire corpus of songs reboots itself and moves on. So that it has a culture, what we would call a culture. But birds generally don't have rhythm. Apes are missing link, can neither entrain to a rhythm like insects, nor can they learn songs. They lack the two prerequisites of musicality, which are vocal learning and entrainment. Apes, however, are fantastic at creating gesture and communicating through gesture in all sorts of ways. So what humans do, they can put together all these parameters, these dimensions. So humans have rhythm, we can dance, and we can clap to patterns. We can certainly learn songs. We have a musical culture, and we have musical gestures. If you watch what a conductor does in the podium, they're gesturing, and we imagine music as a sort of sonic gesture. So we put together rhythm and vocal learning and culture and gesture. So although we have evolved from different branches of the evolutionary tree, we can put everything together. So this is why we're unique. We are the great synthesizers in nature's music.
Well, I mean, I think you're suggesting there's more to it than that. It's not just that our music is richer and denser and more complicated, but it seems like it serves a much more important purpose. I mean, it's kind of like our music is to their music the way language is to communication, right? I mean, other animals communicate, but other animals don't have language in the way that we do. Um,
Yeah, it's tricky to differentiate language from music because originally they were the same thing. So if you imagine far, far back in time to Neanderthals or even deeper to Homo erectus, their vocalizations were equally musical and linguistic. They were communicative. So hominins would use these vocalizations to do various jobs. Um, it's a way of coordinating behavior, such as hunting or celebrating. It's a courtship ritual, um, similar to what birds use song for. So Darwin's theory of sexual selection argued that the male bird would sing and impress the female bird, and the female would be impressed by the um, vocal prowess and the size of the repertoire of a nightingale. And the male bird would also use song to create a territory and to ward off potential rivals. So song wasn't just beautiful, it had jobs, it had functions, and we can hypothesize that hominins inherited these functions. So vocalization would help to bind the community together. It would help courtship, and the mother could sing to their child. We call those lullabies today. And also, in terms of beauty, it's a bit like the peacock's tail. You know, it's a sonic version of the peacock's tail. It was beautiful, and also impressive by virtue of the capacity it was displaying for symmetry.
Mm.
So to create symmetry was very impressive. It's a sign of intelligence. What symmetry in music? Well, we call that rhythm. If you can beat in time. This is what hypothesis. If you imagine back to those rock quarries 2 million years ago, if Australopithecine or Homo erectus could beat in time, that would have been impressive. And cross-modally, analogous to the ability to create a biface, which is a symmetrical two-faced hunting axe. So to create a symmetry in a tool was cross-modally analogous to sonic symmetry of beating in time.
This is like Tony Manero. So Tony Manero and Saturday Night Fever is basically just reenacting a sexual signaling ritual that is very common, right, in other cultures.
Yeah, and in some ways things haven't changed that much in 2 million years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you also tell a story of how music has become somewhat marginalized, right? I mean, even though we have this nonstop soundtrack in our lives, and there's people walking down the street with earbuds, right? Generating their soundtrack. It has become somewhat marginalized, I guess, in the way that poetry has, right? People talk about poetry and prose, and poetry is kind of limited to this relatively narrow, abstract part of our lives when it used to be, a dominant form of communication. I mean, I think you're making the point that music was sort of everywhere in our work lives. We would, if we were in the fields, we'd be singing. If we were in the mines, would be singing, right? If we were in the boats, we would be singing. I mean, we would incorporate music into our lives. And I guess the other part of the story is about how the passive aspect of consuming music has sort of split off from the performance and composition bit, which has now been delegated to specialists.
This is the funny thing, especially in the West, that we draw a line between those who make music, composers and performers, and those who consume music, the listeners. And if you look beyond the West, and many cultures in Africa or South America or Southeast Asia, most people are participatory. There is no line between the creation of music and listening. Everybody should join in. Whereas today, most music is passive. We listen to it, and we are sort of indoctrinated into this ideology that music is genius, that you have to be, talented to be a musician, and we put composers like, I suppose, Beethoven on a pedestal and imagine that they're inspired by the divinity. But that's very far from the case. Everybody is born with the capacity to be musical, and that ability is often taught out through our educational systems. So we're very quickly taught that music is a talent, and most of us aren't musical, and that isn't what happens. Preschool, and you watch the interactions between a mother or a father and their child, and that duet, uh, you know, where the parent sings and touches and smiles at the child, and engages in what's called motherese or infant-directed speech, which is cooing, but it is that magic, spot in between singing and speaking, and is completely natural to a parent. And it's interactive or participatory, that it's about the dialogue or the duet between the two people. And that relationship, it's a social relationship. It's the same skills that later on you would observe in a string quartet or in a jazz band or in a, music is always a duet or an ensemble. It's social through and through. The idea that music is something that a composer transmits like a letter is then opened by the listener in their armchair is ridiculous. And you can explain why the West has become like that. And it goes back in some ways to the invention of music notation. So about 1,000 years ago, the West invented staff notation, where you write music down in a score. And that is a kind of guillotine which slices the musical fabric, and then you have music which is on the page, and then it's then decoded and performed and listened to far away from where it was created. But there are, of course, lots of advantages to that, to do with, you can disseminate music far and wide beyond the interperson relationship. And this is the story of how Western music conquers the world on the same ships which take, the Spanish to Mexico, and Cortes, takes Spanish polyphony to 16th century Aztecs, and how missionaries go to Africa and spread Christian hymn tunes. And it's also one reason why most national anthems in Africa sound like, Christian hymn tunes with Western tonality. So with scores, you get essentially the onset of globalization. So there's a quid, and there's a two sides to the coin. It's the story of the West, and we shouldn't overemphasize that it is a Western disease, because you have lots of other examples of art music traditions in India and in Vietnam and in Iran, in Persian music. There's a tradition of art music which is important. We shouldn't be too woke about it. There's a space for all kinds of music, folk music and social and pop music, as well as art music. And we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, I was a DJ, radio DJ in college, and created for our station the first world music show, right? Although we didn't call it that at the time. And it does seem as if these trends, they do look like Westernization, but I think some people, like in other domains, would say, oh, well, this is just sort of a inevitable trajectory, right? It's just, progress. And a big part of it also is not just the separation of performance and listening, but also kind of a increasing level of abstraction and removal from the physicality. I mean, I remember going to see like Yosundor in concert in the 80s, and it was in a dance hall, right? I mean, you'd go there to dance, and fast forward 20 years and everybody sees them in a performance hall and they have their hands on their lap, and if you were to stand up in the aisles, you'd be viewed as being somewhat eccentric or rude or maybe native, right? I mean, is that sort of the part of this trajectory, this kind of, I don't know, elevation into some very high level of abstraction that is removed from physicality?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be too mystical about it, that it's essentially no difference to what happens to language. This is what language is. The language is printed. First it's symbolized, and then it's notated, and then it's disseminated. So what we're seeing is that music starts to become more and more like language. And you can also extrapolate back to 40,000 years ago to the symbolic revolution, where we think that Homo sapiens first invents symbolic language, and at that point, going back to the South German caves, we see the first bone flutes, and we see the first uh, realistic figurines of the human body with the Venus of Holofernes. So humans learn figurative representation at the same time as symbolic communication and how to make music technology. That is a symbolic revolution, and everything flows from there. Now, what's interesting is that it flows in a direct line into Western art music, whereas if you go outside the West, the paths of music become more, I hate to use the word natural, but they don't approach the condition of language in the way that it does so in the Western path. My book is very careful not to valorize the Western path compared to the path of China or India or Islam. They're all equally interesting, and in some ways they are more valid than what we did in the West. And what we gain in precision of notation, we lose, say, in the acoustic quality of notes. So we have a much less sensitivity to timbre, which is the sound quality of a note, than we do in India, and much less interest in rhythm than you get in West African drumming and so on. What we gain is polyphony and counterpoint that only the West really explores the vertical dimension of music. What happens when you layer lots and lots of parts simultaneously, and you don't get that much outside the West.
Well, you did mention that the Polynesians had counterpoint, and this was something which
no one knows
surprised.
why.
Yeah, yeah. But you also mentioned
one knows why.
And you mentioned ornament in Arabic music, and what you call taste in Indian music. And I have to say, I wish this book should have a soundtrack. I spent probably countless hours on YouTube, right? Just looking up every single thing that you mentioned, from the Kazakh music to the Qawwalis and all this other stuff. It was just, you have to. Luckily, everything can be found pretty much on YouTube if you run a search. But you also mentioned something about the brain, and you said that if you are a musician, you're basically left-brained, and if you're a music consumer, you are right-brained. So, I mean, does that only kick in with notation, or does that kick in when one becomes familiar with the language of music without
it kicks
notation?
in with training. It kicks in with training, and it's fairly plausible that if you train somebody, the brain, which is plastic, changes. So what people find is that what we know, the left side of the brain is associated with language processing. So most people who are not musically trained, they listen through the right side of the brain, which is more emotional. Once they undergo music lessons, it shifts to the left side, in which case they process music much more like they do with language. So they're more sensitive to structure and to layering, to hierarchy. And we can measure that. We can scan for that.
Yeah, I mean, you also emphasize the role of emotion in music, right? And how it's kind of hard to separate them in the way that you can separate it in language. I mean, you pose the question: can someone like Mozart produce music like Mozart without the capacity to feel the emotions that we all get when we listen to Mozart. I mean, could someone just sort of learn? I mean, the way a machine right now, we have music that is composed by algorithms, right? And it's highly unlikely that these computers experience emotions, and yet they can. If you tell it like, "Hey, produce some music that's sad," it can crank it out. Produce some music that's angry, it can crank it out because it has labels that have been provided by humans. I mean, can a musician
there you are.
Can a musician produce music that is, heartwarming and tear jerking and be sort of an automaton or a robot or devoid of emotion themselves?
No, I don't think so. And if we have a discussion now on AI, we'll never finish because the jury's out. It's a very exciting time to be alive.
Mm-hmm.
But keeping it for now on emotion, if you put two, psychologists in the room, they'll all have a different definition of emotion. It's the most complex word in the language, next to nature. But let's not simplify emotion into a sort of physiological frisson. Emotion is everything. It's human behavior. It's not just feeling, it's also action. And I was very inspired by Darwin's book on the expression of emotion in humans and animals, where he argues that emotion has an evolutionarily adaptive function. So the basic emotions, are to do with the achievement of goal. If you achieve your goal, you're happy. If your goal is blocked, you feel anger. Fear is when you're threatened by something dangerous, and you can act in different ways. You can freeze, or you can fight, or you can flee. And love is about sex. So I don't think there is you can't separate the feeling from the ethology, the ethological dimension of the emotion. And how do you get from there into music? Well, I hear music as gesture. Even though you don't see anything, it's invisible. I mean, there may not even be any words. It could be a jazz improvisation or a string quartet. Music evokes a sense of emotion, of something virtual, in a virtual landscape, moving and gesturing, and also a sense of voice. There may not be a lyric, there may not be a human voice, but a violin or a guitar can definitely evoke a sense of voice. So you got your voice, you got your gesture, you got your action, you got your movement, all the ingredients of behavior, of emotional behavior. And music is incredibly eloquent in communicating emotional behavior. In short, music mimics. It's like a mimic, like a great impressionist. And they do say the great artists like Proust, like Shakespeare, like Mozart were fantastic mimics. I would even say they're like comedians. If you watch Robin Williams or a great comedian, they have this quicksilver, mercurial, protean ability to switch to like water from one. If you watch Robin Williams, doing one of his things, he will move like quicksilver from one person to another. And I hear Mozart like that. I hear Mozart concerto like that. And that is a very human ability. I don't think a computer will ever learn to do that, because you have to be alive, you have to love, you have to interact socially, you have to absorb other people through interacting with them, and that is a quintessentially human ability.
Mm-hmm. Well, I find it interesting that the same organ in the human body that is responsible for interpreting sound is also responsible for balance and movement, understanding. And I think I forget who it was, you quote somebody in the book who asked this hypothetical, right? If you were to put someone on a desert island and remove their voice box, and you had another person on a desert island, and you were to essentially tie their hands behind their back and prevent them from moving, which one would come up with language first, right? And we often emphasize the sound aspect. We always say, oh yeah, when Australopithecus developed the voice box moved up and the throat and so forth, that's when they were able to speak. But others would say that bipedalism is sort of at the heart of it, because we can walk and we can move our
Yeah,
hands and so forth, right?
yeah,
So which is
yeah.
it? Is it about movement, or is it about sound, or is it about both? I mean, can you separate them out?
No, you can't. I think the theory is that you know, 4 million years ago, once we started, to stand and to walk, then what happens is that the brain starts to knit together, the auditory cortex and the motor cortex, a sense of balance, and they start to co-evolve. So already you start to identify motion with hearing and with muscular exertion, and indeed the rhythm of two-step, left, right, and every bar of music today in human music is permeated by this walking rhythm. We ineliminably hear music as walking, because that's how we evolved as as a species. Um, uh, and we have two ears, and so we binaural, and we hear in stereo, and we sort of echolocate our um, ecology in terms of sonic perspective, as if we're walking through it. And music has a space, not just through having a pair of speakers, but the music itself has evolved to be spatial. And we do think of music as walking through a landscape, a virtual landscape. And that is a very human thing, things to do with our bodies. So we can't really abstract the acquisition of music from the evolution of our bodies and our physiology, including standing up and our sense of balance. It's why we talk metaphorically about music being balanced and music having up and down, climbing and descending. So we think of tones going up and coming down, and many cultures do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly unlikely someone who's deaf from birth is going to become a musician. What about somebody who's paralyzed? I mean, is that also going to impede one's capacity for musical talent? I mean, I guess the question is, I mean, it seems like if it's rooted in this physicality of humans, then there should be a universal musical language. People who have been trained in anthropology are generally suspicious of universals and emphasize the plasticity and how, oh, well, the major key means this and the minor key means that in the West, but why would we ex ante assume that there would be the same um, emotional register in other cultures? But I think you're saying that there are these universals. I mean, in particular, you've got this up and down, right? Where no matter where you go in the world, right, higher pitch, people think of it as an upward movement, and the lower pitch, there's a downward movement. So what else is there in the universal language of music?
Let me just correct myself. We have a propensity to think of scales in a vertical dimension, but having said that, many cultures don't do that. So other available dimensions, some cultures talk of small and large notes, or thick and thin notes. That's what the Greeks thought.
Right.
And they overwrite these more cultural adjectives over perhaps a more inborn adjectives. But no, I don't mean that music is universal. Our propensity, our capacity for music is universal. And then we're born into a culture, and then this is why every musical culture has different vocabularies, different scales, different instruments, different vocal types.
Well, but I mean, there are some things, right? Like, isn't a military march? I mean, you don't have to explain that to somebody. I mean, presumably, I mean,
Well, it's very simple. It's very
Darwin
simple.
encountered when Darwin encountered the Fuegians, right? Like,
Yeah,
would a
yes.
military march have made sense to them?
Well, I think what is unusual about the Western rhythm, especially in commercial pop music, is how simple our meters are. The idea of having 4 to the floor or 2 beats in the bar. if you're a West African drummer, or you know, it's simple-minded. It's by the same token, it's much harder for us to learn. It's not impossible, but it's to learn clave rhythms in Cuban meter or polymeter from Ghanaian drumming. Um, so, but that's something which is taught in the culture. And if you take a baby and you plonk them into a different culture, then they can have a much different capacity for tolerating dissonances. So the example of gamelan in Indonesian gamelan orchestras, they have a taste for what to our ears sounds like a hideous dissonance of a minor ninth, which reverberates, and they savor the resonance of the minor ninth, or to our ears, a mistuned octave. It's a matter of enculturation and learned taste, and every culture has a different tradition. And the universal is the talent, the capacity for music, and I think all children generally are born with that capacity, and then that is adapted by the local culture, the local tradition.
Well, I mean, there are some people that think that certain types of music or certain ingredients in music have some basis in nature, right? So the Greeks in particular were fascinated by these regularities in the scales, right? And octaves and fourths and fifths and so forth. Um and that this was rooted in mathematics, right? I mean, you'll often hear people say, "Oh yeah, math and music very closely related." If you're good at math, you'll be good at music. I could never really understand what they were
Yeah,
talking about, but maybe you'll be better at musical theory. I don't know. I mean, what's the relationship there?
it depends what kind of maths it is. So um, the what one cross-cultural difference you can draw is between the Greeks and the Chinese, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Chinese. I'm talking of 400 BC. Um, and it's been said that the Greek world, and we stem from the Greek world, that was a string culture, because they theorized music in terms of subdividing the string of a harp mathematically, following Pythagoras' theorems, where the strings, you know, you can generate intervals from the octave or the unison through the fifth and the fourth and the third by arithmetic divisions of the string. You don't get that in China. So the the famous bronze bells, the Marquis of Zheng bells, which are about 400 BC, the 66 bells, which um, together constitute a sort of chromatic scale. Now, it took Europe 1600 years to come up with a chromatic scale, because they're starting out from a different mathematical starting point. Um, but what you get in Chinese metallurgy already at that time is an infinitely superior understanding of acoustics, which are mathematical, but they draw a different conclusion from that. What they get from that is a sensibility for timbre, for the tone color. So people tend to call Chinese music a bell culture, and they call the Greek tradition a harp or a string culture. Both are mathematical, but they draw opposite conclusions from the same maths.
Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting. You talked about the sort of war between the strings and the winds, right? Like Apollo and Dionysus, right? Sort of how these different types of
Yes, yes,
instruments
yes, yes.
corresponded to sort of different
Yeah,
aspects of
yeah,
our humanity.
yeah. Well, that's already, ingrained into Greek tragedy. And so we're talking of Aeschylus and um, uh, the great plays like Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. But the basic myth underlying these plays is a war between strings, and the aulos. The aulos was a double-headed oboe. Now, it was said that the aulos came from Asia and colonized Greece. The problem with the aulos that you couldn't tune it, and it sounded bestial or animalistic.
Mm.
And its god was
And it was
Dionysius, whereas the god of
also you also mentioned the ram's horn, right? Which was big in Hebrew.
and for the Jews, yes.
Yeah.
In some ways, each of the great ancient cultures, the Romans, the Greeks, and the Jews had their totemic instrument. For the Greeks, it was the aulos, and Dionysius, the god of blood and passion and intoxication. For the Romans, he was a trumpet. All the great Latin epics talk of the symbolic significance of the army, Caesar blowing the trumpet. It was the embodiment of military supremacy. And for the Jews in the Bible, he was a ram's horn. So when you talk about the great trump, pun intended, or it's not trumpet, it means the ram's horn. And when you blow that horn, it signifies, in an eschatological sense, the coming of the Messiah, and it had the capacity to bring down the temple. It had this, potentially very destructive sonic force. I'm thinking of, the climax of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's imbued by that sort of messianic, that divine sonic quality of sound. And so much of the Bible, of the Old Testament, we talk about light, that there be light, but the energy of God is as much to do with the danger of sound for the Jewish faith.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine at war without music, right? For much of our history, it's hard to imagine religion without music for much of our history. It's probably also hard to imagine theater and storytelling and poetry, right, without music. I mean, how do we know? I mean, I remember listening to the translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, right, with Robert Fagles and Ian McKellen, and they would occasionally put a little bit of lyre music in there, just to kind of give you some feel for kind of what it might have been like in the original. I mean, was music sort of an accompaniment to every aspect of our lives at one point, or every aspect of our social lives?
I think so. I think it always soundtracked every activity. The idea of the modern concert, where you abstract music from society and you put it into a concert hall and you listen to it out of context. It's very, very strange thing to do. Why is music spiritual? It's because you can't see it. Unlike vision is out there. When you see an object, you have this external, objectification of that source. But with music and sound, it's inside you, and the ontology or the experience of sound, that is, it's internal or inside your mind, and you can't see it. So it's intrinsically related to spirituality. It's invisible, it's ineffable, it's interior. It's linked to contemplation or meditation and prayer. So it makes sense that music evolved side by side, hand in hand with spirituality.
I mean, it seems like the death of God has followed the removal of music from the service, right? I mean, the places where you still have a strong religious culture are the places where you still have music in the services, it seems.
That's an interesting comparison. I hadn't thought of that.
I mean, I know people who are dead in the wool atheists who, when they listen to Bach or when they go to Evensong, they are
Yes.
tempted. They're like, okay, maybe I'll maybe I'll reconsider my position on religion.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
as soon as they
Yeah.
leave, and the soundtrack of God is over, then they revert back to their atheistic ways.
But you see that also in a lot of Hindustani or Carnatic music in the Indian subcontinent, where music is a natural vehicle for rising towards God. So, a raga will gradually rise over the course of its 20 minutes to an ecstatic apex. And that point is where you identify where the singer brings the audience with them to identify with the divine.
It's like
So
a
the
rave
idea
in a
of
way, right?
it's like a rave, it's like a rave, but the idea of tones rising to a zenith of ecstasy and gradually taking, step by step, taking the listener with them. It's as old as time, that idea.
Mhm. Now, how much do we know about what the ancient Greeks actually listened to? And even further back, how much do we know about what our, caveman or Neanderthal ancestors listened to? I think you said there was some tantalizing hints of Mesopotamian music from some notation. And I did listen to that piece of, I guess, ancient Greek music that you
Yes,
referenced.
yes,
It
yes.
sounded remarkably modern, actually. I was
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
surprised. I mean, how certain are we that that is what the music sounded like?
We can be pretty certain with the Euripides fragment that it's what it would sound like today, because the notation was fairly clear. Regarding the Sumerian tablets, we have no idea what it sounded like. Um, it can only be a wild guess. The get out clause, we can look sideways at what um, hunter gatherer cultures today are doing, and make some educated guesses that people such as the Inuit of North America, or um, the pygmies of Cameroon, um, and the tribes of Australia. What they have so much in common in terms of their way of life and the kind of instruments they can make and their performance practices, that it can't be an accident that there's a common historical core that has survived many, many tens of thousands of years. So the kind of guesses we would make is that generally most music would have been shamanistic. Um, uh, it would have had a very strong bond with nature and the landscape and totemic animals such as kangaroos or whales or buffaloes. Most music was percussive. That people hadn't discovered how to make string instruments yet, and often these percussive instruments were attached to the body, like bells or castanets, and so music flowed naturally from dance. There wasn't that distinction between dancing and music because how you moved created the percussive sounds,
Mm.
and also the sort of songs they would sing were often in the moment. The idea of ritual, of repeating something, which we take for granted, might have happened more 12,000 years ago when farming was invented and
Mm.
people invented the great circle of life to do with the circle of the seasons and of the stars and of tradition of handing things down to the next generation. So that link between the circle of life and ritual and repeating a song, you can guess would have been invented 12,000 years ago. Before then, songs would be more like a game which you make up on the spot, or like the activity of running or dancing. So these are by and large educated guesses, but we can see symptoms of that already in contemporary hunter-gatherer cultures across the world.
Now, you talk about the great homogenization. I mean, those types of music are presumably dying out along with the languages that these people speak. But it also seems like more recent types of music are also in danger of disappearing, such as the the songs that people would sing while working. I mean, you referenced the sea shanties, right? Which were
Yeah.
really an artifact of the type of work, which is you're doing sales
Mm.
and that kind of stuff. And the plantation music, right? Which was really a function of, repetitive agricultural work and so forth. I mean, what are we doing to preserve? I mean, do we have like the Lomaxes of the world going around and,
Yeah.
recording all this stuff? And is it kind of becoming blended with is it being absorbed into the contemporary music, or is it just completely disappearing?
So there was a fad for sea shanties during COVID for some reason,
Yeah, I
and
remember that. Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I think it turned out to be a New Zealand whaling song that became
Mm.
viral, and it was more or less reinvented from scratch, and it's what's called an invented tradition, and we do that all the time. um, I'm quite relaxed about things dying, about music dying. Most music has died. Um, the music we seem to care about in the West is only 500 years old, which is nothing in the great scheme of things. Um, Outside the West and outside of music, if you look at the arts in general, carvings and canoes and sculptures, most people are habituated to the idea of things being transient, like a firework display or a dance. And the pleasure comes in preparing the meal. It's like food. You prepare the meal and you enjoy the meal, and the meal disappears. Nothing wrong with that. We're very fixated in the West, I think because of the Greek temple idea, the idea of enduring for millennia. It's a Greek temple, it made out of stone. It's very unusual, but in the West, the tradition of great art has been imprinted by the idea of the temple, which lasts for thousands of years. It's not very healthy. I think we should enjoy art whilst we can, and when it goes, like a firework display.
Yeah, but we're also recording everything now, so we have the ability to access the kinds of things that we never had the ability to access before. And so one would think, I know in marketing we talk about the long tail, and we say, oh wow, now all of a sudden we have all of this ability to listen to anything. We can listen to pygmy music if we want to on Spotify, but it seems like everybody just listens to Taylor Swift, right? I mean, no matter where you go
Yeah,
in the world, you're going to find Taylor Swift in Bangkok and in
yeah.
Bujumbura, and no matter where you go, you're going to find the same stuff, right?
I don't think everything actually is recorded. It's a minuscule minority of stuff ends up on Spotify or elsewhere, and it's retrenched and whittled down to the same old things, Vivaldi or Taylor Swift. And also you have, given the enormous ocean of data, how do you curate, how do you manage the attention economy? Because people have a finite attention span. So you can drown, you can lose yourself in this sea of data. It's not very healthy.
Well, you mentioned at
Yes.
one point that the Renaissance folks like Monteverdi, they thought they were resuscitating, right, something from the past, that they were restoring something which had been lost during the 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 Christian era, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
did they know? Were they just purely speculating?
Yes, of course they were. So Galileo's father was Galileo Galilei, who's a music theorist in the late 16th century. He wrote a treatise which claimed that he understood ancient Greek music theory. He was completely wrong. But he infected the Florentine Camerata, a think tank based in Florence, who then, cooked up opera. So Monteverdi then was commissioned to write an opera by this Florentine Camerata on the basis of Galileo's false theories. This is how opera was born. They thought they were resuscitating ancient Greek opera, but they were completely wrong. They're inventing a tradition, which is fine. It's fine, but it wasn't really a return to the past. We do that all the time in different ways.
How has the kind of, I guess, increased ubiquity of music, the ability to tap into music at any moment of any day and create this soundtrack? I mean, is this a way of kind of going back to the past where we were surrounded by music, or is this represent something very, very different from that universality of musical experience? I mean, is it primarily now it's more of a solitary experience, people with their headphones? Do people view music kind of functionally? I've been fascinated by this emergence of functional music that they have now on Spotify
Mm,
and Apple Music, which is more or less created by algorithms. And I was also fascinated by this notion that when you're young, you try to amplify your emotional state, and when you're older, you try to counterbalance it. Right? So when you're young
yeah,
and you're in heartbreak, you play music
yeah,
of heartbreak, and then
yes,
when you're
yeah.
older and you're in heartbreak, you play like Pachelbel and then Vivaldi and stuff to try to cheer you up. I mean, how are contemporary musical consumption patterns different from or similar to what we've seen in the past?
Well, just to pick you up where with your last point about how you can, use music as a medicine. Um, so the way we self-regulate when we're teenagers is different to how we use music when we're older. The Greeks knew about that, so they saw a
Mm.
link between music and what they called ethos, which we would call character. It's a moral or medicinal dimension, which we're rediscovering now. And one of the most exciting new um, developments is that we're understanding that we can prescribe music as a kind of drug.
Some of this music's like opiates, though. I mean, like smooth jazz. I mean, there are classical radio stations now that only play
Yeah,
adagios. This is like nonstop
yeah,
adagios. It's like
yeah, yeah,
it's like opiate, right?
yeah. It's music as relaxation, and music should do much more than just relax you. It should make you think and make you feel more alive. Yeah, the ubiquity means it's as available now as water and air, and it's become cheapened. If you were born in Beethoven's day, you would be lucky to hear a symphony twice in your lifetime. And when you
Mhm.
did, it was special because most of the time you were in silence, and we've lost silence. So yeah, it's swings and roundabouts. We have this fantastic availability all the time, everywhere, everything now, but it means we don't value it very, very much anymore. And that's very dangerous. And it can be used for, as the opiate of the people, as Marx would say, to um, to sedate us and to um, anesthetize our critical faculties. It's different, it'll be different again in 100 years' time, I predict. I'm not pessimistic. I just think it's interesting how it's always changing.
Mhm. Or to agitate us, right? So if we want to,
Yeah,
get excited about going into battle of some kind or another, right? We
yeah,
could,
of course, of course.
yeah.
That's always been the way. It's why you have drums and trumpets in wars on the battlefield.
You said that the musicians in the Roman legions were paid the same as the folks who
Yeah,
actually did the fighting,
indeed,
right?
indeed, indeed. And the first person you should kill is a trumpeter because
Mm.
they lead
They keep
everybody else on.
everybody, yeah, they keep everybody in sync, right? Well, I do want to ask
Yes.
you about this, machines making music now because it's becoming a big thing, right? Where you can ask the algorithm to crank out some music, and I think some people think they're going to replace the composers. I think others are thinking, well, no, no, no. What you're doing is you are democratizing the creative capacity. So it used to be that we had divided the world into the music producers and the music consumers, but now there's a way of kind of
Hmm.
allowing anybody to crank out some music and throw it up on TikTok and so forth. I mean, is the increasing availability of these tools that allow you to spin up beats, should we think of that as musical composition? Using a beat generator and a melody
Yeah.
generator. Um,
Look, I'm not that impressed because I think that throughout all of history, music has used tools or extensions of the human body. So what a piano is, it's a machine. And if you can compose at the piano, are you cheating? So we know that Stravinsky and Beethoven composed at the piano. That's it, like their version of a laptop.
Yeah.
A laptop doesn't compose for you. It's a tool that you use to compose better, or broaden your repertoire, or augment your ability, or your physical ability. So we get very carried away and into panic mode about AI replacing the composer. But on the other hand, there's always space for bad music, for functional music, for videos, or for apps and computer games, or for films. If you need to fill a 3-hour movie with a score, then generate it artificially. Why not? And just as there's room for very good music, where there'll be a richer input from a single human being overseeing everything. So let's not forget there's space both for bad and for good music in this world.
Well, I mean, we could imagine a world where everyone composes their own individual soundtrack, right? And the machines would learn what you like and what makes you feel the way you want to feel, and it would just sort of train on that and start spitting out right new synthetic versions of what it is that you seem to like.
But then again, you want to escape yourself and learn something new. You don't want to be yourself all the time. How would you ever develop if you did that?
Yeah. Wow. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining me. This is really a fantastic book, The Musical Human. I've always thought of myself as a musical human, even though I have not been a musician at any point in time, but it's an integral part of my life. And so it's great to understand not only the science, but also the history of how we got to where we are. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.